Hi guys, and welcome to the first webinar for the Nutrition for Athletes unit. My name is Ewan and I'm one of the trainers and assessors here at FIA Fit Nation. This unit is made up of two separate units of competency, and we're going to start with the first one today, which is providing nutritional information to athletes. This will form a good base for the second unit, in which it looks at specific design of diets for particular athletes. Before we get started, I just want to outline the different learning outcomes that you're expected to achieve through the completion of this unit. So on this slide here, you can see there are 5 different learning outcomes that are part of this unit of competency. First up, we need to analyse nutritional information. That obviously takes on a variety of different aspects. So it can be analysing the diet itself, but it can also be analysing sources of nutritional information. Obviously, nutrition is a component of the fitness industry that is constantly changing. It's a component of the industry that is constantly providing conflicting evidence, and we as professionals that are going to be providing nutritional information to clients and to athletes need to be able to critique this and provide the information that's most appropriate for our client. We're also going to look at liaison with nutritional support personnel. So one of the things that you need to be able to do when you're working with an athlete is recognise the input and impact that other health professionals can have on that athlete's performance. And bear in mind that you're just going to be one member of that team. The third learning objective is to provide information to athletes. So obviously, when we gather all of the information that we want to share with the athlete, we need to give consideration as to what is the best way to do that and how can we get our point across so that they value it and they see the benefit of your input. We then obviously need to, from there, assist athletes in their implementation of the recommendations and guidelines that you have put in place. This will tie in quite nicely with the coaching and motivation units that you would have completed in trimester 1. And lastly, we need to evaluate the effect of our nutritional practices on the performance of the athlete. So it's one thing just to change the diet and to make changes that you think would be of benefit, but we then need to measure that and make sure that we're actually getting the outcome that we'd hoped for. The first part of this unit is to review, if you like, the basic principles of sports nutrition and what it's aiming to achieve, if you like. So first up, we need to make sure that the guidelines that we are getting our athletes to follow allow them to meet the energy or nutrient demands that are placed upon them. Obviously, the athletic population have a much higher need for energy, and with that, all the other nutrients. So as well as looking at the macronutrients, we also need to consider the micronutrients because of the impact and the different roles that they take on within the metabolic processes that are obviously speeding up as a result of taking part in training and in sport. Sports nutrition should also have the aim of enhancing the adaptations that you get as a result of taking part in sport, and also maximising recovery and allowing it to occur in the most time efficient manner possible so that the athlete can then train again and further increase the adaptations that they are subject to because of their training program. And lastly, we also need to look at maintaining health and well-being. This is something that can quite often be overlooked by athletes. They're so concerned about their performance that that's what becomes most important to them. And they quite often ignore their health and well-being in response to that. What we need to make sure that we do is all the guidelines and information that we provide to athletes have this as the number one priority. So that is what they are trying to achieve first and foremost, with their performance secondary to that. There are numerous examples of this. So if we say take athletes who need to make a particular weight to compete in sport, quite often they will practice some really dangerous activities in order to meet that required weight for them to compete. We often see endurance athletes, for example, in terms of economy of movement, it's beneficial for them to have a really low body mass because it means that they have less weight to carry around their track or the course, whatever it may be, and as a result they expend less energy doing that, so they minimise body mass to potentially dangerously low levels. That's something that's very common in the female population and in particular marathon runners. Next up, I want to just look at the support personnel that you are likely to be working with as a fitness nutritional coach. What you can see here in the centre of this diagram, we have the athlete, and it's really important that we remember that Even though all of these different support personnel will have different contributions to the athlete, their goal is exactly the same, is maximising performance and health and well-being in that athlete. I just want to take a little bit of time to kind of run round these different roles that may be influencing the athlete's performance, so that we have a rough idea of where we as the fitness and nutritional coach might fit in. So starting on the left hand side of the slide, first up we've got our sports coach, and obviously their primary objective is going to be in relation to tactics and technique. That's not an area that you're going to have much input, if any input into, but bear in mind that that sports coach is going to want that athlete to be able to perform to the best of their ability every single time they step on the pitch, on the court, or whatever it may be. As a result, as the fitness and nutritional coach, you will liaise with this sports coach and look for the ways in which you can actually maximise their performance and keep the sports coach happy, if you like. A similar role to that is the team manager. In some sports this will be exactly the same thing, but in some cases there will be someone above the coach who is overseeing absolutely everything and coordinating all the different parts of the athlete's program. So you may have a liaison there where you need to work out the best time at which you're going to, say, provide an educational seminar on nutritional practices, or the best time at which you're going to analyse the team's diets, or how you're going to integrate your dietary practices into their training routine. The fitness coach is a role that you may yourself be taking on, and you may have that dual role where you're then providing the nutritional information as well. Obviously the fitness coach is going to have some knowledge of nutrition, and obviously that can at times provide great opportunities to learn from each other, but it also can potentially bring about conflict, which is one of the main things that I will address in the next slide. Depending on the level of athlete that you're working with, you may also come into contact with a doctor. They may be telling you about a condition that the athlete has, or they may be mentioning an injury or specific nutritional requirements that an individual has. You obviously need to take this advice on board and manipulate your practices to meet these recommendations. Whilst you may be a fitness nutritional coach, the team may also have a nutritionist or dietitian that you need to liaise with, and obviously you need to take your guidance from them if they're considered to be senior to your position. Physiotherapists will be extremely important, particularly in times of injury. So obviously if an athlete has picked up an injury, that's going to change all of their dietary requirements, both in relation to enhancing their recovery from the injury, but also making sure that they can maintain a body composition that is appropriate or near to appropriate for performance. Massage therapists will also be linked in similar ways. Another role that's becoming much more common, and a lot of institute of sports will start to have with more so individual athletes, is a lifestyle coach, which is kind of a more holistic approach to the well-being of the athlete. Obviously you will have the chance to interact with this lifestyle coach and make sure that you're providing information to the coach that can then perhaps be passed on to the athlete in a more appropriate manner. The last one that we have there is a media advisor. Now obviously we're talking about athletes that are perhaps of a higher level, but it's maybe not initially obvious to us what impact that may have on us as a nutritional coach. But the main way in which I can see this impacting upon the athlete and your interactions with the athlete is that quite often higher level athletes have sponsorship deals that they need to consider. So for example, they may be sponsored by certain food products, and as a result they need to be seen to endorse them, whereas whilst they're endorsing them, that might not be the type of food or drink that they need. So, you know, if they're part of an ad campaign for, say, Gatorade, but you recognise that that's perhaps not the best product for them to be consuming based on their individual needs, then you need to think of ways around that, because it could potentially have an impact on that athlete's income and their recognition within the industry. So a couple of generic points to consider if you do find yourself working with a variety of support personnel. First up, you need to have a clear understanding of what your roles and responsibilities are. That's obviously up to your employer to determine that. They need to say, what you need to be doing is X, Y, and Z with each of these athletes, and I want you to liaise with X, Y, and Z to make sure that you reach the conclusion or reach the outcome that we're aiming for. You need to make sure that you fully understand those and you know where to draw the line. The issues and conflicts start to become apparent when that line is a little bit blurry and you're not sure what you're meant to be doing, what's the role of someone else. So if you're in this situation, make sure that you have a clear understanding. You also need to have this understanding of the roles and responsibilities of each of the other professionals. And this is equally important because you then know who to refer on to. You then know that if you reach a certain point and you think it's above and beyond your scope, then you know who to pass that on to as well. It's really important that you respect the input and opinion of the other support personnel. Remember, they have the same goal. We all have the same goal of trying to maximize performance in that athlete, and therefore that is what the aim of all of the practices will be. Now, you may disagree with some of them, and it's fine to voice your concerns, but make sure you do that in a respectful and appropriate manner. And I want to move on and look at specific sports. So one thing that we quite often see when we look at the kind of support personnel that are working with athletes is they quite often come from a sports background. They tend to have experience in that sport, and it just seems like a natural progression once their playing career finishes. And that can lead to the misconception that in order to work as a support personnel within a particular sport, you need to have experience in that sport. And the first point on this slide addresses that. Is 100% not a prerequisite to work with athletes that you need to have played that sport previously. So there may be some of you sitting there thinking, I'd really like to work with athletes, but I've never played sport in my life. That 100% does not matter. Okay, so it's certainly a population group that you may need to consider working with. One thing, however, that is really important, and this is probably where those that have played the sport have a little bit of a head start, is they will know the sport inside out, and they'll know how it feels to play it, and they'll know the demands that are placed on the athletes that are taking part in it. Obviously, if you've never played the sport before, then you're not going to have that insider knowledge. But there's ways around that. The way that you can do that is through a needs analysis. So when we're doing a needs analysis in nutritional terms, what we need to consider are things like the gains, durations and intensities, which is obviously going to influence the second point, which is the energy systems that you're utilising throughout the performance. You're also going to consider the types of movements. So are they explosive or are they more endurance in nature? This is going to all influence the types of nutritional practices that are going to maximise performance. That can obviously be done generically for the sport, but we then need to do a needs analysis of the individual athlete. So what are their specific issues that need to be addressed? This should look at things like their strengths and weaknesses in relation to performance. Now, obviously here you are likely to seek the input from some of the other support personnel. Particularly, you're going to be liaising with the sports coach, the team manager, and potentially doctors and physios should there be any underlying injuries that you feel need to be addressed. You also want to look specifically at recovery. So how long does it take them to recover from training sessions? How do they feel after training sessions? Do you feel that nutritional practices could improve that recovery process? And also performance trends as well. So if you're working with a team of athletes, then you may find that certain athletes tend to pick up injuries at particular times in the season. Can nutrition have an impact on that? You may find that within an individual game, we see a decrease in performance towards the end of the game. Can nutrition have an impact on that? So these are obviously templates almost that you would need to set up for the athletes that you're working with. And that's obviously something that you can put together yourself. But these are just some of the key areas that I would suggest you look at when you're doing a needs analysis of A, the sport, but also B, the athlete. And the last point on this slide, just make sure you seek support from the other personnel that are involved with that athlete, because they will be able to assist greatly in the needs analysis that is essentially going to shape the nutritional practices that you try to implement with the athletes. So just to give you an example, we're going to look at field sports first up. So by field sport, we're essentially meaning, say, soccer, netball, rugby, for example. They are characterised by unpredictable periods of intermittent high-intensity work. So by that we mean that there's large fluctuations in how intense the session is, and as a result it can be quite unpredictable. Because of this fluctuation in the intensity, we see production of energy through all three energy systems. As a result, that presents us with quite difficult nutritional challenges. It would be much easier to address the nutritional needs of a purely endurance athlete or someone who is entirely based around power. But we've got a bit of a combination here, so finding that balance is something that could be quite difficult. We could also consider field sports to a certain extent, be endurance in nature, as total playing time in these events can be anything from 60 to 120 minutes potentially. So obviously there's an endurance component to it as well. So as a result, it's almost taking the nutritional guidelines for a variety of different sports and we're trying to merge them together to optimize performance. Other features of the sport that you may wish to consider is, as we've already touched on, that interspersed high intensity activity with low intensity activity. So, if you consider something like soccer or AFL, for example, there will be periods where they're sprinting flat out and then that'll be followed by a walk or stationary for a period of time, followed by another sprint. And it's entirely unpredictable. You don't know how that's going to vary throughout the game, and you don't know how that's going to change from game to game. I'm sure those of you that have played team sports before will have played some games where, you felt absolutely destroyed by the end of it, but then you'll play other games where in the last minute you still feel like you're going as well as you were in the first minute. So things can fluctuate from game to game, but obviously there is general patterns that we'd be seeing in the sport, and there's obviously a lot of research around this as well. Within field sports, there's also formal and informal breaks in play due to things like half-time, but also injuries and substitutions. This can be a really important component of the sport for the nutritional coach, because what it allows you to do is to implement the nutritional practices that you feel would assist in improving performance. In sports that don't stop, it can be a little bit more difficult. So if you consider someone who's running a marathon, they obviously don't have the time to stop at the side of the course, take on whatever supplements or fluids they feel are required, and then start up again. They need to try and integrate that during their performance, which can be very challenging. With field sports, we also need to consider that the demands that playing different positions will bring. So if you, say, have a forward versus a back in rugby, the requirements for the performance are entirely different. Someone in the back may cover a lot more distance, but they don't have the same requirement for strength and power, say. So keep those differences in mind. It may not just be appropriate to do an analysis of the entire sport. You will need to look at different positions as well. And as we've already touched on, those activity patterns throughout participation are entirely unpredictable, and as a result, that produces further challenges for you as the nutritional coach. So with these things in mind, we can start to put in place some generic dietary information. Now, today I'm just using one example of field sports. When you go into your material on the online learning platform, you will find that there are a variety of different sporting categories for which we have similar information. So, pre-event or daily nutrition recommendations for a field sport athlete. Firstly, we need to consider our glycogen stores. As you will all know, glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrate, with carbohydrate fueling high intensity activity. As we've touched on, field sports generally have a high intensity nature, so as a result, glycogen storage is going to be fueling that, and therefore we need to make sure that they are full. Ways in which we can achieve that is through an elevated carbohydrate intake. So on here you can see we've got 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrate for lower level performers or those that are in less mobile positions. However, if you're an athlete that's perhaps performing at a higher level, covering a little bit more ground, working at a higher intensity, then that will increase slightly. So you're looking at 7 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrate for that category of athlete. Obviously, that's something that you can calculate for your individual athletes using that formula based on their weight. To build on this further, we may also want to look at our pre-training or game meal as well. And generally what's recommended here is that the meal should consist of 3 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. And this meal, with this recommendation, should be consumed somewhere around 2 to 4 hours prior to performance. One thing that's important to note here is that digestive discomfort with pre-training and game consumption is something that you will need to consider. This is very much an individual process. So, for example, some athletes may well be able to consume more than that 3 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight, and that's great, but some may well need to consume less because they get digestive discomfort, which would then affect their performance. So with these practices, it's always good to trial it prior to actually implementing it before performance. So use training as exactly that. Use it as nutritional training. See how they work on different meal plans, what's the type of response that they get in their performance, and then you can pick what's best and implement that prior to the game. Protein is another very important component of the diet for the field sport athlete. Generally, a protein intake that's slightly elevated from the general population of 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilogram of body weight is considered appropriate. However, if you're looking at field sport that has a higher strength demand and therefore will change the type of training that that athlete is doing, then you may well look to increase this slightly to 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. An example of an athlete that would need that would be someone such as a rugby forward, for example. Hydration also needs to be addressed, so within your reading material you'll find a lot of specific formulas that you can apply to the athlete based on their weight and also the weight loss that they experience during performance. During game and training nutrition is also something that we need to address, and as we said, with field sports it can actually be quite easy to do this, and it's something that you 100% want to implement with any athletes that you're working with in this particular category of sports. So because of those breaks, we can give nutritional advice or nutritional supplements during performance. One of the main areas that we're going to want to address is the carbohydrate stores. They are of greatest concern because depletion in those carbohydrate stores is going to lead to a shift towards fats, which is going to mean we're going to be performing at a lower intensity. The majority of studies would suggest an intake of around about 70 grams of carbohydrates per hour of activity to be appropriate. Although obviously this is going to be largely dependent on the position played, the amount of work that person has done and the distance they have covered, but as well as that, their weight. Obviously someone who is heavier is going to have more muscle mass potentially, and with more muscle mass we have more glycogen storage. So their stores may not deplete at the same rate. So it's a very generic recommendation. You could adjust that for your client depending on what their performance outcomes were. The ways in which we normally achieve this is through the consumption of energy drinks and bars whilst participating in exercise. That tends to be the easiest way to do it. I know we generally recommend avoiding the simple sugars, but with athletes, because they're burning it off and they have that demand for it and they have demand for it to be provided quickly, this is one of the best ways to do it. And this is essentially what these products are designed for, but the reason that we have this negative view of them is they have become readily available to the entire population that do not perhaps need this. Just a word of caution, particularly if you're working with younger athletes. I had an experience of working with younger athletes and they were training very regularly, they were competing at quite a high level and they relied heavily on these energy drinks. They were training sometimes 3 times a day and they would turn up to each training session consuming one of the energy drinks, and then they would perhaps consume another one during performance. This basically led to all of their teeth rotting away because it was such a high sugar consumption. Although they were burning off a large part of it, it was still probably excessive. So keep that in mind with younger athletes and look at that as an opportunity to educate. The last point we have on here is maintaining hydration, and generally we're looking at 120 to 180 mils for every 15 to 20 minutes of exercise. Obviously it doesn't need to be consumed every 15 to 20 minutes. You know, the game structure is going to influence how regularly you can consume that, but that will give you a rough idea of how much fluid you want your athlete to be consuming during their performance. Following performance, we then need to give consideration to what that client is then going to eat. Now, for a lot of athletes, after they finish performing, the last thing they want to do is to consume food. They don't feel hungry because of the nervous system responses that they have experienced during performance. So glycogen stores, again, this is the main thing that we're coming back to. They're likely to be depleted and we need to replenish them. They can be replenished at roughly 5% per hour, so that means we can completely replenish them within a 24-hour period. The way in which we go about doing that is initially we have a consumption of somewhere between 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates consumed within 30 minutes of activity. That's actually a more substantial amount than you would initially expect, and the way in which that can be consumed obviously varies. If your athlete is happy to eat, then that's probably the best way to do it, but supplementation may need to be considered in that area as well. It may get a little bit higher than that should your athlete have taken part in maybe a particularly difficult game or is known to be more mobile than some of the other players. So bear in mind that can also increase. Rehydration is really important as well. So a rehydration rate of 1.5 litres for every kilogram of weight lost. So it's really important as the nutritional coach that before and after training sessions you weigh your clients, because that is going to allow you to determine how much fluid they then need to take on. And remember, consuming too much fluid can also be detrimental to performance as well. Okay, so it's important to try and get that balance. Before I move on to this slide, I just kind of want to summarise the things that I've gone through. So what we've just gone through there is a large part of one of your assessments. You need to pick a category of sport and essentially go through that process that we have just done there for the field sports, providing recommendations pre, during and post exercise. This is obviously just one example. Your reading material has a lot more in there, so I would suggest you go and dip into that and make sure you're familiar with the recommendations for the different category of sports. One of the main things that you're then going to need to do if you're in a position where you're providing nutritional information to an athlete is to analyse what they currently do. Now, this is something that you cover in quite a lot of detail in one of your other modules, so I'm just going to brush over it here in this PowerPoint, although you will find much more extensive information in the reading material. But we need to consider interactions with the athlete. First up, it's really important to establish a rapport. Athletes can be a challenging group to work with in some cases because they are in some cases relatively well educated on fitness, on health, on nutrition, and they can quite often present with a know-it-all attitude, if you like, and this can make establishing a rapport quite difficult. Obviously what you need to try and do there is find a common ground, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to chat about the sport that they're playing, the performance, how the team's going, things like that, and get that common ground that you can then refer back and forth to. You then want to establish the reasons for the consultation. So what do you think you as the nutritional coach can bring to the athlete, and does the athlete have any concerns or anything that they want to raise about their performance or about their nutritional practices that they feel may be an issue? Next up, we've then got the screening processes. So generally the screening process will involve the recording of the dietary habits, but you'll also want to run through the screening processes that you'll quite often use with your fitness clients as well. So PAR-Q, lifestyle questionnaire, interviews and things like that as well. That process is something that you'll need to set up and can almost add into what you currently do. This is something, as I said, that will be covered in much more detail in the other unit within this trimester, and you'll get a lot more information there. And then obviously we need the review, and that can be the initial review but then regular review throughout agreed periods. It's important that you come back to the information that you initially gathered and review progress towards goals and review progress in terms of the dietary changes you've perhaps recommended. Dietary changes is something that we're going to discuss in more detail in the next PowerPoint and webinar for this unit. Alongside the analysis of the athlete's diet, you can view this as an opportunity to actually educate the athlete as well. So what you need to do in this situation is identify the need for teaching. There can quite often be misconceptions with different products that are available to the athlete, and regularly this is supplements. Supplementation is a huge industry, and obviously the main aim of a supplement is to address any deficiencies. Athletes won't know if they have a deficiency or not, but they may well just take a supplement because of the advertising it's been given. So it's really important that you identify if that athlete needs to be taught something. Another area that may be important is illegal substances. So obviously one of the main areas that you need to be concerned with if you are providing supplements to an athlete is, are there any banned substances contained within that product? And this is something that the Australian Institute of Sport have great information on their website, and I would really recommend that as a supplementary resource for this particular unit. So identifying the need for teaching is step one, but then the opportunities for teaching is another one. When is it best to try and educate the athlete on their nutritional practices? From my own experience, trying to separate this completely from performance and separate it from training is generally the best way, because they obviously have a lot of things that they're focusing on at that time. So creating an entirely separate component to the consultation that is away from training, away from competition, is the best way to implement teaching. That said, it can be beneficial for you to maybe attend training sessions and just drop in little bits of information as they're performing. You can explain to them why, when they get to the end of the workout, they feel as they do, because energy stores have been depleted, and if you consume X, Y, and Z prior to performance, then we can delay that feeling, for example. Education can also improve adherence. So if someone knows the reason for doing something and they know it's going to have a positive impact, then they're more likely to stick to it. If you just tell someone to do something without explaining the why, then why would they do it? They don't know the reason for it. They don't know the impact that it's going to have. And I think that's something that I would really suggest you emphasize. And this can apply to your personal training approach as well. Why are you doing it? What is the reason why? If you can answer that question and justify it to your client, then you're much more likely to get that adherence. Next up, we've got providing information that is valuable and engaging to the athlete, focusing on the expected performance benefits, and those last three words are probably the most important. How can the things that you're telling them to do impact on their performance? Is it going to make them quicker? Is it going to make them endure more exercise? Is it going to make them faster? Those are the ways in which you're going to engage the athlete. That's something they'll be interested in. So make sure you make that reference to performance on a regular basis. It's also important that you consider that there are a variety of teaching methods that are possible. So it can just be casual chats, but you may well look to set up more formal seminars at which you present the key aspects of nutrition for that sport. It may be on an individual interview basis that you incorporate your teaching. It may be through online means. You may record webinars as I'm doing here and make that available to the athletes. You may send it out in an email. So bear in mind that teaching doesn't mean just standing up in a classroom and sharing the information. There are so many different ways in which you can do that and implement it into the services that you're providing. In terms of content, that was everything that I wanted to cover today, but I just wanted to go through the assessment structure for this unit of competency. The assessment layout is very similar to what you'd have experienced in your last trimester of work. There are three assessment tools for this unit. Assessment tool 1 is your smaller activities, so there are 6 different sections in there, and those activities are covering the support personnel, the dietary guidelines for specific sports. So obviously we looked at field sports today, but there's a whole bunch of other categories that you can pick from. We've got the nutritional consultation with an athlete, and then we have the needs analysis as well. Assessment tool 2 looks at sources of nutritional information. So as I mentioned right at the start of this PowerPoint, as a nutritional coach, you'll be expected to perform your own research, dissect that information, critique it, and then come up with the application that you're going to provide to your athletes. And then last up, we've got assessment tool 3, which is looking at eating disorders within athletes. And this is something that unfortunately is quite common, particularly with endurance athletes, but also with athletes that need to achieve a particular weight in order to perform. So you can see within this unit there's quite a nice balance to a variety of different areas, and it's very much real life. This unit is great at providing you with knowledge and skills that you will use directly within working with athletes. That's everything that I wanted to cover today. I'll be back in a few weeks to deliver the second webinar for this particular unit. Good luck with it, and remember, if you do have any questions, do get in touch with your online trainer. Thanks very much for your time, guys, and I will see you soon.